Trump and Putin are known to be bullies. They bully people all the time. And I don't think two bullies versus Zelensky, who is a brave man, but I don't think would necessarily produce the right outcomes. This is going to be a peace process. Those people that have skin in the game, and that is Europeans as well as Ukraine and indeed the United States, should be part of that peacemaking process. And look, I think, you know, what I would say is I think there could be a meeting even if there's no outcome. I would disagree with you, Kate, about that because President Trump likes the fanfare. He likes the event. He likes the sort of, the popping of corks. And he'll be on to something else a few weeks later saying, I tried, or indeed we got a deal, even though the deal is, set in sand, not in concrete.
Can we imagine Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky in the same room discussing how to get at least a pause in the war in Ukraine? It may seem unlikely given how little progress has been made, but Donald Trump has told European leaders last night, including Sir Keir Starmer, that he hopes to meet Putin face to face and soon. That three-way meeting could follow shortly after. So should we be hopeful or suspicious? Sir Ben Wallace is a former Defence Secretary. He was in post when the Ukraine war began, or at least this particular stage in the Ukraine war began 3 years ago. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
Well, what do you make of these reports from Donald Trump overnight that there could potentially be a meeting between those three leaders? Should we be suspicious of this and what it means potentially for Ukraine?
Well, I think we should be sceptical about what it means for not just Ukraine, but the continent of Europe. Donald Trump is a man who's always interested in effectively the event rather than the outcome. He likes the wedding, but doesn't really care much about the marriage after it. And I think that's what he's probably been angling for. He's been angling for a massive summit between the big guys in the room, as he would probably see it himself. President Xi maybe one day, certainly President Putin. He bizarrely, even though Russia has a minuscule economy compared to the United States, it's even smaller than the United Kingdom's economy, he seems to sort of level himself as sort of equals, and he likes that idea of superpowers versus the rest, which is why it's been made clear already by the White House that Europeans won't be invited to any of these summits, which is, I think, worrying given that, Europe will face the consequence of another rotten Trump deal. The Trump deal of Afghanistan was rotten, and look what happened as a result of that. So I think we should be skeptical. Look, if it's a step in the right direction, it'll have my support if that's what they're trying to do. But we already know that Putin's demands are so unrealistic for Ukraine and Europe that it is unlikely there would be much long-term progress. I mean, Putin had been, until even yesterday, was demanding, the recognition of all the invaded territory as by the international community as Russia. He wants Crimea recognized. He wants the de-arming of Ukraine. He wants them ruling out against their own constitution ambitions to NATO. And he wants to be brought back into the warm embrace of the international community and sanctions relief. Well, I can't see Europe agreeing to any one of those conditions, let alone all of them.
And all of those things were things that Sergey Marov, who is a former advisor to Vladimir Putin, spoke to us earlier on the programme about. I mean, is that why we should be a little bit wary of this meeting? Because in theory, a meeting like that would only happen if something had been agreed. And we have absolutely no idea what Steve Witkoff may or may not have agreed to in that meeting with President Putin. Is there a possibility here that Ukraine could be strong-armed by Trump, by Witkoff, by these talks into something it really doesn't want to have to agree to?
Yes, there is a concern, and I think that's why there are two other nuclear powers in NATO, France and Britain. I think it is important that in the room should be a European power because both Trump and Putin are known to be bullies. They bully people all the time, and I don't think two bullies versus Zelensky, who is a brave man, but I don't think would necessarily produce the right outcomes. This is going to be a peace process. Those people that have skin in the game, and that is Europeans as well as Ukraine and indeed the United States, should be part of that peacemaking process. And look, I think, what I would say is I think there could be a meeting even if there's no outcome. I would disagree with you, Kate, about that because President Trump likes the fanfare. He likes the event. He likes the sort of, the popping of corks. And he'll be on to something else a few weeks later saying, I tried, or indeed we got a deal, even though the deal is, set in sand, not in concrete. So I don't know. I think he's been pushing to meet Putin for a very long time since he returned to the White House, and he's probably found an excuse to do so. I'm not sure how long the secondary sanctions will hold, as we've already seen. Yes, he's done it, but I suspect, knowing the economic illiteracy of this current White House, I suspect that these sanctions have been put in place for actually other reasons, which is effectively finding a hook to put them on against India from a position of United States view in how he is delivering his sanction policy.
Yeah, I want to come back briefly to the secondary sanctions in just a moment, but on some of the terms of this potential agreement, one of the things that is being talked about is an air truce. Would that be, in your view, an acceptable thing if there was an air truce offered, if that was something that could be agreed on? Would that be a good deal for Ukraine? Would that be something that could be taken forward?
I don't think it would be a deal. I just think it would be a step. And look, of course, it would be a good thing if we stop the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas in Ukraine by Russian long-range drones. I think that is horrendous. It's like the V2s and the V1s of the Second World War being lobbed from deep inside Russia. That has got to be a good thing. There was a sort of temporary air ceasefire, if you remember, during the May Day celebrations because Putin was worried his parade in Moscow might get hit by drones. The problem is we found at that time there wasn't really an air truce. There might have been a sort of strategic bomber air truce, but these drones that are causing so much death and also have changed the modern battlefield, they're tiny things. It is highly unlikely that there would be a truce of the use of those because they're viewed as tactical. They're used as assistance to army units. So I suspect the front lines will still be littered with these type of drone attacks. And in fact, drone attacks that maybe span 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, but not thousands. So I suspect that all it will do is probably placate Donald Trump for a press release, but I'm not sure it will make any difference on the battlefield unless it is linked with a plan alongside it. And I think if, traditionally, diplomats in all countries right now would be preparing for Donald Trump and Putin a roadmap to go alongside the summit, if that's what it is, to say, right, the next step is, we get the short-term air truce. The next step is withdrawal of troops by a few kilometers. The next step is, all of these sort of things. Now, I don't see any evidence of a roadmap in any way being communicated publicly or indeed worked upon, and that'll be the tell.
Do you think then, as part of this agreement, that Ukraine may have to agree to cede some territory?
Well, I think Ukraine, President Zelensky has to navigate a way through with his own people. His people have sacrificed thousands of their lives to defend and indeed take back territory. People forget that when Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, effectively the conflict between 2014 and the invasion had already cost 18,000 lives in so-called sort of static wars, frozen conflict. So the Ukrainian people have suffered a lot. I think Zelensky will absolutely be in a space of reality. He's going to have to do his very best with what he's got. He would be much better helped if he had a unified international community standing beside him with the clear indication, as to be fair, Keir Starmer indicated, we're with you for 100 years. If the international community had said very clearly, we ain't going anywhere, that will have an effect on Putin, just as his economy starts to tip in the downward trajectory. But I'm not sure we're going to see that from the United States. Europe has started to step it up. But yeah, look, I think Zelensky will have to craft a ceasefire or indeed a deal that does recognise some of the realities, but it is entirely up to them. Yeah. After all, it's their land that has been stolen from them by Russia. It's not ours.
Finally, Ben Wallace, I want to ask you about a slightly different story. We had Louise Ward-Hunter, who's the Chief Executive of the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, on the programme earlier on, and I asked her whether there could be anybody who will be off the table when it comes to investigations into what happened in the Troubles. I want to ask you, because I know you yourself had experience of being there with the British Army during that period of time. Here is what she said in response to that question.
One has to ask, why would anybody be afraid of the truth? Why would anybody be afraid of having that investigated? Not every investigation, and we know this, will lead to prosecutions, but that truth is important to those people who lost family members or who are grievously injured, as I've said before. But vitally, that is about building a confidence in society that we can have the platform to reconcile.
Ben Wallace, what do you make of that response?
Well, look, on the plus side, she talks about reconciliation, and I was both in Northern Ireland during the first ceasefire in 1994, and indeed I was the Northern Ireland minister, and then I was part of introducing the legacy bill that Labour have decided they're going to hollow out or scrap. Look, ultimately it's about reconciliation. It is also about drawing a line under history, and no one is frightened of the truth. But what we are experiencing now is a rewriting of the truth by one particular side, one particular group of lawyers, and re-investigations and re-inquiries into what they would call state killings. That is when British Armed Forces or British and RUC took action against terrorists. That is being, I mean, some of them are on like their third public inquiry or inquest into that, and people are saying, hang on, we told you the facts. You might not disagree, you might not agree with them or support them, but I was there on the day. What I don't hear from the terrorist side in any of this debate is a willingness to come forward with their truth, a willingness to say, yes, it was me and my friends who were shooting at you in the Turf Lodge in 1992. We don't see any of that. And because of that, and because the record keeping kept by the state exists, but terrorists didn't keep records, the practical effect on the ground has been huge numbers of re-inquests and re-investigations around the state, because we've all got the records and we know who did it, because no one hid that. Most people came forward, but nothing really that's producing any results from the terrorists. And I think that has got to be important. All the way through this, we're supposed to be having a community balance, talking about both sides, but making sure people don't rewrite history. If what we see at the moment is allowing people to rewrite history, I don't support that. I think we should be going to a place where the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement was about drawing a line. We let out of prison all those terrorists that had killed many of my colleagues. That was a reconciliation. It was very difficult for my community, the veterans, to take, but we did it because it was a cause of peace. I think that is what it's all about. And if we can't have reconciliation, this legislation that the government has paused basically was all about, if you come forward, if you speak the truth to the Commission, if you tell people what you have done or reference that it's always there in record, then effectively you are given a form of amnesty or immunity to move on. If you refuse to, then you're open to re-investigation. And funny enough, the vast majority that be open to re-investigation or continued investigation would be the terrorist groups, because they don't really like coming forward. And I think it's really interesting that the resistance seems to only help that lot of people, but not really the veterans who fought so hard to protect the innocent.
Sir Ben Wallace, the former Defence Secretary, many thanks for your time this morning.